Welcome to this meeting. We'll call it to order. The roll has been taken, right?
Yep.
Perfect. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest for any of the items on the agenda today? Seeing none, we do have two presentations for today's meeting. So I will pass this off to Andrew Mirabella from Hudson Consulting. Can you hear us, Andrew? Oh, there you go.
I can, yep. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Andrew Mirabella, Associate Partner at Hemson. You'll be receiving two presentations from Hemson, one from myself on the development application fees, and my colleague partner at Hemson, Craig Binning, is also on the line, who will be doing something on the front-end financing arrangements. So I will start off with the development application fees, and I will also share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see that. A thumbs up or a yes? If,
Yes. Yes.
okay, okay, excellent, great. So I know I believe I've been allowed 45 minutes for this. I'm going to try and keep my presentation to around 25 minutes or so and leave some time for questions. So I will get right to it. So really today's meeting is just to go over the development application fee study process, talk a little bit about our study objectives. I'll provide a brief overview of some of the legislative framework that we're working towards. And then I'll go through kind of some of the technicalities in terms of what our cost recovery analysis is. And when we talk about cost recovery, it's both obviously on looking at the cost side of the work, but also the revenue analysis and what revenue projections we're looking at. And that kind of forms the basis for our full cost recovery fees. We've also done a benchmarking analysis, and we are providing some implementation options for consideration to the group here, which we're looking for some feedback on following my presentation. So we were retained to undertake this full cost of service analysis, particularly for the development application fees, which consist of really three key areas. We have planning application review services, fees under the Building Code Act, as well as engineering review fees. As part of our mandate, we did undertake a high-level comparative review of user fees in other municipalities and how those fees compare to Brantford, both in terms of the current and calculated rates. The information that we have is to be used when you're setting your fee rates, whether they're at the full cost recovery rates or otherwise. When we think about fees themselves, the definition of a fee is very well established, and it differs from taxes in two very distinct respects here. One, a fee is levied for a very specific purpose, and the second one mean there has to be a nexus to which the fee is being charged and the service is being provided. And from a legislative standpoint, particularly for the fees that we're calculating under this study, there has to be a very strong relationship between that nexus, and particularly for some applications under the Planning Act, direct correlation between the application type and the service that's provided. So I wanted to provide some context. It's a pretty rigorous exercise to understand the mapping and the cost considerations for each of the applications and the fees that we're looking at here today. So when we think about cost recovery, amongst the best practices by the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, is that the full cost of providing services should be calculated when determining and setting user fees. And usually costs are delineated between your direct costs and your indirect costs. Direct costs are going to include all things such as salaries, benefits of the departments that are actually providing that service. Then we also would layer in operating costs, so the resources that those departments or those people use to deliver that service, as well as any asset management requirements or reserve fund contributions. The second component is our indirect or our corporate overhead costs. And that's really a function of costs that are incurred by corporate departments, mayor and council, office of the CAO, any general administration who don't actually physically handle any applications, but they're involved in making sure the corporation runs, and those costs are incorporated into the analysis as part of our full cost recovery exercise. So when we did our analysis and we look at our calculation methodology, the first thing was it's an activity-based costing approach. It's done on an application basis for planning and engineering and on a bit of a broader scale for the Building Code Act. The analysis set on a 5-year time period. We used all recent information from budget data as well as revenue information to inform our forecast going forward. Our current costs, as I mentioned, follow that best practice approach between your direct and your indirect costs, as well as an inclusive provision of a reserve fund provision, which we've allowed for to offset revenue shortfalls in periods of slow activity. That's required under the Building Code Act in order to at least try to capture those costs, which we've done. And then we've also made provisions both on the engineering side as well as the planning side on a reserve fund management side. One thing that we've done from a fee setting perspective is we look at things as well as anticipated costs. So when we think about additional staff resources, those are all captured within the process within our 5-year time period. Staff in most departments are pretty equipped to manage the activity that's being projected in this planning period, and that's part and parcel of some recent hirings, particularly on the engineering side. We have flagged some additional FTE requirements of building services, which may be required to maintain that high level of activity moving forward. So we've incorporated some of those costs built within this planning horizon, recognizing that any of those FTE needs are still going to be subject to budget deliberations on a go-forward basis. We've also built in any new technology and software implementations which are on the forefront of what might be needed, studies for future fee reviews, as well as simple workstation capital replacement. So those costs are all embedded into our cost analysis itself. So just to provide some context on our legislative framework, we're really working within 3 pieces of governing bodies here. We have the Planning Act, the Building Code Act, and the Municipal Act. The Planning Act allows the city to establish, we call the tariff of fees for the processing of planning applications made in respect to planning matters. There isn't a public process that's particularly required under the Planning Act for changing fees, but the fees can be appealed to the OLT. Council has some specific authorities, which is different from what we call maybe what you see under a Development Charges Act, where council has the authority to waive or reduce fees on a case-by-case basis for planning fees. There's been some recent legislative changes under Bill 109, which require refunds to certain applications if no decision is made. And that Bill 109, that process has really kind of put this study at the forefront here and what really initiated a lot of it. And this study work obviously is taking into consideration some of those changes, and the city on a go-forward basis will have to work under the parameters of those refund requirements and processing timelines as required under the Act. The Building Code Act, very similar to the Planning Act in terms of identifying the reasonable cost to administer the building code. There is a public process required, so moving forward, when we do, if the fees were to be implemented, we would have to undertake a public meeting for the building code. And then some of the other fees, particularly for engineering, would fall under, some of them would fall under the Municipal Act, which is just a general fees for providing services on the municipality's behalf. So to get into some of the technicalities, summary of our costs, and this is looking at both the direct and indirect costs. So when we think about all the planning, the building, and the engineering fees that we're looking at, we've identified a total annual average cost by service area cumulatively around $9.2 million. And you see the pie graph looks at building, engineering, and planning individually. So, and then we have a corporate overhead component there as well in red. So I wanted to kind of highlight the corporate overhead. That represents 12% of the total cost. But planning and engineering from our direct cost standpoint is very similar relative to the cost of delivering the services, and building is about $3.2 million. The relationship that we see from a direct versus indirect cost standpoint is reasonable and pretty consistent with what we see in other jurisdictions. And the contribution to reserve funds are also included in the direct cost analysis, which represents about 5% of that total cost. So we certainly look for the relationships between direct and indirect, and just to see if that fits in generally what we see in other communities, and that seems to fit the bill here. But it's a $9.2 million cost of providing that services each year. And when we think about that cost, you know, what's driving it? And it really is, these are applications which are pretty labor intensive, for lack of better words, meaning that it's staff on the grounds, reviewing applications, processing the applications, communicating right with the applicant, and getting through the processing timeframes. Meaning that there's quite a bit of hours that are actually involved. And when we talk with everybody, we've come up with about 57,000 hours just on planning and engineering fees. And that works about 34 FTEs equivalents when we talk about doing that type of work. And the line graph that tracks on top of the bars is representing or tracking the FTE equivalents. And then the bar graph kind of breaks out your planning and engineering fees in terms of staff time. We certainly see that there's a spike on the graph for things such as plan of subdivision and site plan applications, which have a very heavy involvement on the engineering side when they're looking at the cost of municipal services and looking at reviewing the services and installation of works. And there's a pretty heavy time frame on the engineering division for that. So I thought this is a pretty important slide, just emphasizing the involvement of staff on an application by application basis, and certainly something that does require quite a bit of the city staff's time in order to do the work. So now we have a bit of an idea on the cost side. Then we want to kind of shift our attention to the revenue side of things. And we look at the revenues. Brantford has seen some growth, certainly on the revenue side for application type activity, particularly on planning, building, as well as engineering. So all three, but we do see things kind of have started to stabilize, at least in the last couple of years. But 18, 19, and 20 look very different from 2021. So a couple items here to flag for the attention. 18 to 2022 are obviously actuals that have occurred. We've adjusted them for inflation to current dollars. The last piece of the puzzle there is our forecast average, which is our forecast average annual revenue that we're assuming for the purposes of setting fees, which is about $6.9 million a year cumulatively for those three types of applications. You'll see that the activity that we're forecasting for planning, building, and engineering is very well either above recent levels of activities in 2021 or 2022, certainly well above the activity levels seen in 18, 19, and 20, with the exception of the development engineering revenue, which is higher than the average, but you'll notice 2021 activity is much higher on that side, and that was related to some kind of irregular industrial permit activity, which is not going to be seen in terms of our forecast here. So we've moderated that from a forecast perspective going forward. But other than that, we are assuming continued strong activity in all three planning, application, or building permit type fees. And then again, just with that one modification on the development engineering side. So when we think about those two, the costs and the revenues in tandem, this slide is really kind of looking at where the gaps are and where do we see the variances. And on the planning side, we have costs of about $2.8 million. We have anticipated average annual revenues of about 1.4 million. It leaves us with about a 50% gap in terms of what's being recovered for under existing revenues today. On the development engineering side, we're seeing about a 30% gap in terms of the cost analysis relative to the revenues that were anticipated under existing rates. On the building permit side, it's interesting that our revenues that we're anticipating relative to the cost of delivering that service is actually coming in with the inverse, meaning that our current revenues under existing rates would actually exceed our costs. And in which case, even with the reserve fund provision, that additional money would presumably go into additional reserve fund contributions. So there could be a case there that there could be a modest reduction in the building permit fees relative to the cost of delivering that service. I will note that on the development engineering side, although we do see a gap of about 37%, the largest revenue contributor in there is the subdivision engineering review fee, which is pretty well at cost recovery. The gap in that particular service is largely related to things such as site plan and some of the other engineering's involvement in planning application fees. So the variance, for those kind of doing the math, is effectively what the fees would need to be increased in order to cover that gap, or to kind of bridge the gap between our costs and the revenues. And when we do the analysis, because of the way the fees are set, we do everything on an application by application basis, and the fee increases required are going to be different by different components of different applications. The tables here, recognizing they're pretty detailed on both here, so I won't go through all of them, but I do want to highlight, obviously, the green table is our full cost recovery planning fees. The gold table is our full cost recovery development engineering fees. relative to the existing fee rates as of 2022 that were in place. And what we see from our calculated full cost recovery fees, we're seeing some fairly substantial increases across the board, recognizing there are some differences between different application types relative to the involvement of staff at each of those different applications. But on an official plan amendment, we'll see the planning fee go from about $14,500 today to just over $31,000 as a calculated full cost recovery fee. What's interesting is on the development engineering side, the current fee that's been in place is very much under funding what the involvement is on those particular staff members. So on some of those application fees, you're seeing a much more substantial increase with development engineers incorporation on those fees. As I mentioned, just to kind of draw some of the attention to the plan of subdivision fee on the development engineering side. As I mentioned, those fees itself are closer to full cost recovery. So that 6% of total construction cost plus the $5,000 base fee remains very similar under a fully calculated rate. We're still at 6% of the total cost of construction with a modest increase to the base fee itself. And just, as you go through the full cost recovery rates, we do see, as I mentioned, increases of varying degrees between the different application types themselves. So when we think about those fees relative to some of the benchmark communities, what does that mean? And this table at a high level looks at some of the specific fees on planning, building, and development engineering. And I've taken a benchmark, you'll see it on two different slides, one on higher growth municipalities, ones that are seeing levels of growth like Brantford, or ones that have signed kind of similar housing pledges and looking to build more homes. And this benchmark analysis looks at communities as Barrie, Burlington, Caledon, Kitchener, Markham, Newmarket, Ottawa, and Waterloo. The fees that are currently in place in Brantford relative to these communities would see Brantford's fees kind of on the low to medium end of what those fees are in other communities. When we look at the calculated rates that we just saw, we would see that Brantford's fees would start move or shift itself, at least from a placement perspective, more towards the medium to higher end of the fully calculated of the fees that are in place in other communities. Particularly, you would be on the higher end for the plan of condominium, but you would be more on the medium end in most of the other communities. On the building side, you'd remain in kind of the low to medium end of the range of those other types of communities. Similarly, on the development engineering fee, when you're looking at that subdivision fee, you'll be on the medium to higher end of those communities. The one thing that I do want to point out here is a bit of a caveat, I guess you could say, is that this purely looks at just the application fees themselves. It's very difficult on a planning application to compare always an apples to apples. Secondly, Brantford's governance structure is also different than others, where some communities like Burlington have upper tier and lower tier charges. So there would be upper tier government charges applied for the planning application fees. The planning fees and engineering fees, they represent a much smaller fraction of all the municipal fees and charges, which one would pay. For example, development charge would represent a larger share of that total cost. And then the other thing, it's a bit of a qualitative component, but the review times and the quality of service is very difficult to quantify in this type of analysis. And that's not really considered. So how well you communicate, how fast these processing times are, how well does your applications get approved, and how quickly they do, that level of service is something that's not quantified in this type of analysis, but would play into a consideration of what one considers to be the service that they receive when they're paying these applications. The next table looks at the benchmark analysis to more traditional comparator municipalities to yourselves, and which would include one obviously directly next to you, Brant County, and some other communities as well. This one is a bit of a different story where your current fees relative to these communities are already on the medium to higher end or the average to higher end. The calculated fees would place you towards the high end of the spectrum relative to these other communities. But recognizing these other communities may not have the same growth and the same impacts and services that you guys are currently providing. So just to kind of move into some of the implementation options, and when we think about the rates that we've calculated, when you're setting the fee rates, there's a couple things we need to consider. One, there's a shortfall arising from fees that are imposed, which are less than full cost recovery, recognizing that any shortfall is going to be made up by the tax base. There's a general benefit of some services, which might be reason for discounting certain fees. There's a competitive standpoint, which, certainly from an economic development or council perspective, may want to have fees that are in line with other communities, which will fit in with your long-term strategic objectives. Want to be able to consider reserve fund management, and then obviously kind of some of the economic principles of your ability to pay the fees from the end user. I will note that the fees themselves, we always recommend that they're indexed or adjusted annually to account for the effects of inflation, and 5-year reviews are common or a good practice to put in place when looking at the fees over the longer term. So Hempstead and city staff had some discussion around the implementation options, recognizing some of the fees that we've calculated. And we prepared some alternative cost recovery scenarios for discussion and for input. And what we've done is we've done a phase in of the planning and development engineering rates or fees over a 3-year period, where your planning fees would approximately reach 80% cost recovery by year 3, and your development engineering fees would reach approximately 90% cost recovery by year 3. As building is already at, I guess over cost recovery, there's obviously no phase in looked at over there. It's just going to be on the planning and development engineering piece. So just to put that into context, what does that mean from our current rates? And then what does that mean from a tax levy support in order to do that? Right now, we're at about a 50% roughly cost recovery, and we've kind of rounded these figures. But with achieving the 80% cost recovery in year 3 means that year 1, we would move to 60% cost recovery, year 2, 70% cost recovery, and 80% cost recovery by the end of that 3rd-year period. And recognizing as we're increasing our fees in order to get closer to that 80%, our shortfall that we're seeing each year in order to deliver that service starts to shrink. So we're at about a $600,000 shortfall by the end of the period. The phase-in approach that we have there, what we've done is we've tried to adjust different fees and recognizing to get to different cost recoveries for different fees over the period. And certain fees have been reduced or not phased in, I guess you can say, and maintained at lower rates, where other fees we get the 100% cost recovery, and other fees we get to a level that's less than cost recovery. We did this in kind of a consideration of what the benchmarks are and which fees are more susceptible to be at 100% cost recovery than others. So we had the ability from a modeling perspective and technical perspective to make those modifications to the phase-in approach or the phase-in schedule. And we see that we have like official plan amendments moving from a 60% cost recovery to 80% cost recovery in year 3, where we have minor variance applications, which are more akin to kind of residential type applications or general residence, where we've maintained a similar cost recovery with no adjustments to the fee rates there. Where other areas such as subdivision or plan of subdivision applications, we get to 100% cost recovery by year 3. So we've made adjustments to each of the different fee types themselves for planning. On the engineering side, we have a cost recovery phase in. We're at 63% approximately now, and we are moving to a bit more of an aggressive standpoint, about 90% cost recovery by year 3. We tried to follow a similar pattern in the relationship between planning and engineering, of which fees correspond to each other. 100% cost recovery on the subdivision fee maintained throughout, similarly with the minor variance at that 45% cost recovery, with some variances and differences among some of the other fees ranging between kind of 60 to 80%. But You see that the end last year number is the target in which we receive our last year's target or cost recovery for that particular application type. So this is just kind of extracting that, that general graph of our cost recovery, and then kind of pulling that out into the actual fees themselves. And again, the information has been provided, and not to go through the tables in too much detail, but recognizing that, we start off with our 2022 fee, and we see that with the phase in, we incrementally increase the rates over the period. And in instances where we're not at 100% cost recovery and we're achieving 80 or 70%, you'll notice that in reference to the full cost recovery fee, by year 3, you're either at the full cost recovery fee if we're reaching 100%, but if we're not, our year 3 phased in rate would be less than the full cost recovery fee that we've calculated. So this is one way to stage the implementation of those higher rates, provide some transition period for the industry, and also a period for staff and council to monitor the revenues and the trends over the next couple of years. The next slide is just a continuation of some of those fees, some of the smaller end fees from consents and minor variants and part law controls and pre-consultation. What that would look like again from the 2022 fee transitioning to full cost recovery or otherwise over that 3-year phasing period. I just as a note that we did the 3-year period, but that phasing schedule, if there's recommendations to adjust that higher or lower, that could also be done from a Hempson perspective. So that really concludes my presentation. Just in terms of some next steps here, just to provide some insight to what will occur. Obviously, we're hoping today to provide an overview of what we've done thus far, receive any feedback from the committee. We will continue that discussion with the city staff and to refine the rate model analysis and the analysis where warranted. And then we'll be looking at preparing that report and communicating those results, which will presumably be with a discussion with the industry itself, formal presentations to council, and there is a requirement for a public meeting under the Building Code Act. But given that we will be doing one for the Building Code Act, it may be prudent to attach the planning and engineering fees to that public meeting to be transparent. There's a couple recommendations for new fees at this point, or adjustments to the fees, which we'll be looking at, and part of which is one, removing the rebate on pre-consultation fees, which are currently applied against any application that gets submitted. We'll be introducing a new development engineering fee for pot law control applications, which they're involved in, and looking at some new building permit fees for conditional permits and alternative solutions review, with some modifications to the bylaw to make sure other fees are captured within the rates that are set. Sorry, so I've tried to get through all that information in 30 minutes with hopefully there's some time for questions, and I'll leave enough time for Craig to go through the next section. So that concludes my presentation. I don't know if staff have any other comments to what I have, or we're going to launch right into questions.
Yeah, so I think we'll get through both presentations, and then we'll reserve all of our questions for the debate portion of this, since we've exceeded the 10 minutes.
Okay.
So I think what we'll do is we'll introduce Craig and Julia to give their presentation. And if I see no objections from the committee, because I didn't quite waive the rules last time to exceed the 10 minutes, we won't go through and do that unless I see any objection to waiving the rules of naturally. Mayor Davis.
Yeah, these are really two separate presentations. I would really value the ability to ask questions now of Andrew rather than waiting to the end. If you need a motion to. So
procedurally, we would need a motion to extend that. Are you putting that on the floor?
I'm putting that on the floor.
Seconded by Councillor Carpenter. All in favor? All right, so we've extended it for another, I can't see the time on here. Say another 10 minutes for questions. Does that align with what you put on the floor?
However long it takes to be able to
Sure, for however long it takes. Okay, did you have a question?
I absolutely do
All
have
right.
some questions.
Mayor
Thank you
Dickens.
very much, Madam Chair. Andrew, I've got a couple of questions for you. In the comparative municipalities, why did you not include Cambridge and Woodstock? I mean, there you included the county of Brant, but Cambridge and Woodstock are also, very close, adjacent, almost competitors in a sense.
We just looked at some that are around you. We can certainly add and expand our comparator municipality list if that's the desire. Some would have to cut off the comparator list, or else it can go on for days. But if that's a formal request, we can certainly take that back and add to it.
Yeah, because you also didn't include Hamilton, did you?
We did not know.
Yeah. So why did you exclude Hamilton and Cambridge Woodstock? What was the rationale for that?
No particular rationale. We didn't cherry pick the fees. We had a discussion with staff on which ones we thought might suit here, and those are the ones that we had picked, and we can go back and add to it.
And why have you given us like the medium and high? Generally, we prefer to see what those rates actually are in the comparator municipalities.
Yeah, and that's a fair question. It's just the actual applications themselves, and sometimes they're charged a little differently. It's not always a easy comparison, so we try to at least simplify it in some respects. But we can certainly circulate that detailed information or provide that separately, and it will come in the report just from a presentation standpoint.
And the way in which you calculate these fees, I mean, you differentiate between major and minor.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way of doing these fees similar to building permit fees, where building permit fees are a percentage of the estimated cost of construction? So that, because these fees would be fairly hefty and the increase substantial, and might make more sense to be graded according to the size and scale of the project.
So through the chair, the fee structure itself, we didn't make any modifications to the major and minor, and that's most common in many municipalities in the way they levy planning applications. Certain fees, such as your subdivision or your site plan control applications, are levied on a percentage of construction costs, where they're actually looking at the works themselves and the value of it, and that would be an indication of how much time staff would be spending on it. So those fees are on a variable construction cost basis, but the other ones, they're more related to the time associated with people actually involved in looking at it, and a flat fee in that respect is more appropriate.
I believe Nicole had something to add to that.
I was just going to note that, just going back to the actual fee comparative chart, we can absolutely provide that. I think one of the things that we struggle with is that comparison between no two applications are the same. Oftentimes it depends on the site specific situations that evolve. So where we find that it's really challenging to even compare site plan to site plan. It really comes down to the site characteristics, as well as some of the constraints that may be present on one site and not on another. So that's part of a challenge in looking at a straight site plan fee for the city of Brantford versus county of Brant versus Woodstock, right? Is that once you actually dive into the application, it becomes quite challenging in terms of the cost and actually processing that application.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is, are those rates less because they don't do as much as we do? Their processes are more streamlined in terms of what they ask developers or builders to provide?
No, I wouldn't necessarily say so. I would say that, and maybe Andrew can chime in as well, I would say that we would have to look at comparatively at those municipalities and when they ultimately did their fee review, the structure of their departments, as well as the percentage of cost recovery that council has established. So where we're looking at the fees that have been presented in this report, what Andrew's provided is a comparator across municipalities if we were to go to 100% cost recovery. So but many municipalities are not at 100% cost recovery. We're not recommending 100% either. We're recommending an 80% phased in over 3 years. Some municipalities have recently gone through fee reviews. You might see something a little higher, but others have not looked at fees in several years, right? So even doing that type of analysis across municipalities would be challenging. I think how we've tried to structure it is we've looked at The province has identified several fast-growing municipalities. Brantford is one of them. So when you look at the rate of growth in Brantford and the complexity of growth versus greenfield and intensification, we looked at those as being comparator municipalities, not necessarily some of those smaller municipalities that really aren't grappling with the same issues as growth that we are, which makes some of those applications quite challenging in order to process.
Okay. I realize other members may have questions,
That's
but
correct, sir.
well, I still have a few more.
Should
Maybe
Put
I
you
see
down for a
Councillor,
second speaking opportunity.
yeah, I see Councillor Carpenter wants to ask some questions.
Sounds good.
I shouldn't
Councillor
monopolize it.
Carpenter, you have the floor.
Thank you. When I look at your plan of subdivision fees, you know, do you look at the policies of each municipality too? Our policy, I believe, is 4 lots or more. It requires a plan of subdivision. Is that consistent with other municipalities? And are the fees related on the size of the plan of subdivision and the workload that would ensue?
So through the chair, we didn't get into, at least on our side, the specific policies from each of the communities on what would constitute the plan of subdivision. But the one thing that would play into the plan of subdivision rate or the payable rate is the number of units or lots created, because a portion of a lot of the fees, there's a base fee as well as a variable rate.
Okay.
And that variable rate, depending on how many units you're constructing, would play into how much one would pay relative to another, and that's why it gets difficult to compare.
Oh, that's
Because
okay.
if you have a high base fee up front, that doesn't necessarily, you know, if you have a lower subdivision unit count, it might play,
Okay.
you know, someone
So
different.
it's lower base fee and
Yeah.
then per unit fee. Okay, and that's fair. I like that. Yeah.
I
In
believe
your
Nicole had something to add to that as well.
I was just going to add, Councillor Carpenter, through the chair to Councillor Carpenter, just with respect to 4 lots or more created through plan of subdivision. Every municipality will have a cutoff on what they will deal with in terms of consent versus when a plan of subdivision is required. Ours is set at 4. Other municipalities I've seen have been as low as 3, and then some have been as high as 5. So I think Brantford is sort of median in the terms of that we look at anything over 4 lots being created really needs to go through a plan of subdivision.
Okay, a couple more questions if I may. Okay, on the phase and select for planning and development engineering fees, I know the development engineering on a zoning bylaw, major development engineering official plan amendment. It's currently at 1,500, but the year 1 it jumps to 12,900. That's the only one that really jumps out as a large increase. Are we that far out of whack with that one?
Yeah, so through the chair, that's a fair observation, and that one there is a quite a big difference between the current fee and the calculated full cost recovery fee. So we did see a pretty big variance in staff's involvement in that fee relative to the fee that was currently being imposed. In order to kind of keep with the phase and schedule, that one does see a year 1 jump, obviously a fairly substantial proportion, but through the direction of staff and the committee and council, we can adjust the timing of some of those phase increases, but recognizing the long-term goal of the cost recovery target.
And the cost recovery target, that leads a perfect segue. Thank you. So we're recommending a 3-year phase in. If we went to full cost recovery on a 5-year phase in, are you able to do a quick analysis on that by simply punching in the divisible numbers and coming up with what that would look like?
Yeah, we can do that. I mean, not quick enough to be on this call, but quick
No,
enough after this. Yeah.
I'm just, you know, because then we're still not at full cost recovery, but it seems to be 3 years seems to be. I get why we want to go there, but I'm just thinking of a 5-year might be more palatable and might get us to full cost recovery, and it might be lower a little bit. I get that we are going to have extreme growth and we don't want to miss out on the revenue, and taxpayers shouldn't be paying for it. And even at 80%, taxpayers are still paying. So do we know where? Well, as the mayor said, we don't know really where other municipalities are going yet. They're all in the process of reviewing their application fees, and many of them already had their growth spurt that we're about to experience.
Yeah, and through the chair, it's difficult. Just as a comment on application fees, they're not as common as a cyclical reviews of like a development charge where you have an expiring bylaw. Some of these fees may have been in place for years, and they may have been in full cost recovery when they did the fee study, but that may have eroded over time, right? And there's a lot more municipalities doing it now simply because of Bill 109. but it's still a handful of communities. Not everybody is, you know, something like a DC bylaw where no matter what, throughout a 5-year period, everyone has done their bylaw, right? So it's a,
And we don't, it's sort of to back to the mayor's question. Now that's the cost recovery is, you know, our related to our expense side. Have we looked at our expense side to make sure we're as lean as we possibly can be and still give good service?
so through chair, I can comment on, we've taken the totality of the expenses and recognizing that, you know, from what I hear from staff, the service delivery of a highest quality is being done here. So which is considered in our rate analysis, but Nicole may have something more on that specifically.
And I go, so before you answer that, Nicole, and with the provincial government's mandate to build more homes faster, we certainly don't want to have less staff than necessary to make sure we get the job done. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
Could you repeat the question? It's hard to hear in here.
Well, the question was, are we, you know, we're looking at fee structure to be, you know, 80% cost recovery. So the question was very much like the mayor's, are we as lean as we can be on the cost side? Keeping in mind that we want to be as efficient as we can because the provincial government has mandated that we get more and go faster.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and I can say that we do sort of take a fine-tooth comb to our operating budget on an annual basis. In terms of our expenses, for the most part, the expenses is really on planning and development engineering, is really related to the salaries and benefits of staff. For the most part, in terms of, we do have some, you know, training requirements to upkeep our our professional designations, but aside from that, we run a fairly lean budget. So just rounding up in terms of last year, I think our total budget in planning administration was around $2.6 million, where we were covered roughly half of that in fee increases. We've seen substantial increases over the last 3-year period. So we were able to offset that by about $1.4 million and bringing down the tax supported portion of that and you know, combining that with our expenses. So we are running a pretty lean ship, I think, in both divisions, and we'll continue to do so. But we want to make sure that we are you know, adequately planning for the future, because we are in a period of rapid growth. We will be in a period of rapid growth over the next several years, and we want to be able to respond accordingly and not only maintain the level of service that we are providing, but increase that level of service as the demand continues to increase.
And just a quick follow-up question that you may probably refer this to legal. We often hear from legal that we cannot bonus private sector companies, and if we're not at full cost recovery, you can ask legal under the planning or under the municipal act. Could that be considered bonusing because we're not charging the full cost recovery? That's not a question for now, of course. Thank you.
I believe Mayor Davis for a second time.
Second round, thank you. So, Madam Chair, I have a concern that the substantive nature of the increase in these charges will result in some critical comment from those who have to pay it. And one of the things they may say, I'm going to anticipate based on what Mr. Bradley and I were hearing this morning, whether it was substantive or legitimate or not, but it's sentiments out there, and that is, well, I'm playing the hypothetical. Okay, I'm not saying it's true.
Is this a question, or is this?
Yeah, this is a question. It's a question. So that the response of some of the proponents who are applying maybe, well, your planning process or development engineering process is so much more complicated than anybody else's, and you're doing so many more things, and you're requiring so many more requirements for other municipalities, and that's why you have to charge so much. So it's not a question of efficiency of the operation, it's that there's so many requirements. It's way more expensive than other municipalities. So the question is, fair to expect that may be the criticism, one of them. What's the response?
To me.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at you, Chair. Get a
I feel like you're
response.
looking at me through one
I'm
eye.
looking at the Chair.
I'd be through the chair to someone who
That's right.
No, I fully anticipate that will be, there will obviously be criticisms in terms of our process. I think, we've been at this for quite some time. We deal with a development community that on the one hand, we, are providing excellent service, but you're never going to please everybody. And so we have to be prepared for that. I would say that the city of Brantford provides a relatively good level of service to our development community, and that's relevant or evident in the applications that we're processing. The increase of applications, the units that are approved are substantially increasing. So like the proof is in the pudding. The data is there to show that we are increasing service, and the output is there. And that's evident in what we're seeing on the building department side too, right? In terms of the permits, they start generally in planning and move through to development engineering and building. I also think that, we have a strong background in terms of the projects that we're doing in order to streamline our development approvals process. We've launched cloud permit, which we're continuing to do, streamlining. We're even looking at the combination of eliminating certain fees and applications types to streamline those processes. So I think we have that part that we can also speak to. The other relevant point, whether we like it or not, is in terms of a timeline. The province has established the timeline for us. So whether or not the development community wants to complain about the amount of time it takes to process an application or the requirements, the province has essentially said your time limit is 3 months. If you do not approve an application, I'm speaking on zoning for an example, if you do not approve a zoning application within that 3 months, the fee is not applicable. So, right, we have to refund that fee. So, I mean, I think all of the steps that we're doing in order to streamline our process is happening. We are making great strides in doing that, but I think that the fee needs to appropriately cover the cost of providing that service.
But through you to the chair. But are they going to say, are those builders and developers, will they not say, well, gee, in terms of the number of requirements, you have a number of boxes we have to go through and tick off. You've got way more boxes than Woodstock or Cambridge, so your process is more complicated, and that's what makes it more expensive. And yeah, you do it really efficiently, but there's too many steps, too many requirements.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we're always looking at our requirements. And as we said before, it is tough to do a comparative analysis between what may be asked for on one application versus what is asked for in another application. I think that that's a challenging, and it's almost a dangerous comparison in the sense that, well, let's say Brant County or Waterloo doesn't ask for a grading plan. Well, it may not be necessary on that site given the specifics, right? But I do think that our process comparatively is really similar to every process, because essentially it's governed by the Planning Act. The requirements are set out in terms of our policies and procedures on what is asked for, and how we process that information, I think, is important. And that's the part that we're looking to streamline and modernize and improve.
Okay. One last question, if I may, Madam Chair. So and Andrew, this goes to you, which is the 80% recovery on planning and 90% on development engineering. What standard do other municipalities use? They use 70%, 100%? Is there a common benchmark in the municipal community?
Yeah, and it usually does go by application type mostly. So you'll get into instances where your subdivisions and your site plans, those are more common to be at 100% cost recovery, where you get into things such as your consents or your minor variances, official plan and zoning, where there's more of a community benefit perception there, which are often discounted from full cost recovery. So that relationship will, like at the cumulative level, will differ from place to place. But we usually see, if you're going through a cost recovery exercise, you'll be anywhere in most cases between 80 to 100% cost recovery target.
So you mentioned that there is a community benefit. I assume that means that there's a community benefit to growth in some sense. So
right, correct. And if some places they choose to recognize that, and for official plan amendments, there's a general benefit of updating official plan amendment policies and amending them. That would be, sometimes a fee that could be attractive to less than full cost recovery.
Right. And the very last question: do you see other municipalities using a fee structure as a method of positioning themselves to compete against other municipalities, assuming that they're competing to get development?
Through the chair, again, a good question. On the competitive side, less so potentially on planning application fees, simply because it represents such a smaller portion of the total development cost that one would pay when they build. And certainly if there's targeted areas which you're trying to incentivize developments, things such as community improvement plans, which you would waive or discount the fees, that would be an opportunity to do that rather than a kind of a global discount. And then secondly, under the provisions of the Planning Act, you do have that unique authority where you can waive, reduce, or exempt fees on an ad hoc basis, which isn't really the case in some other municipal bylaws.
Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other questions. If we'll move forward, we have one more presentation. Craig and Julia, I believe, are on the line from Hempson Consulting. And we'll just do this right from the get-go. Do I have a motion to waive the rules to extend this past the 10 minutes allowed? Mayor Davis, seconded by Councillor Carpenter. Any discussion on that? And we'll just go as long as it takes, unless someone wants to put a real timeline on that. And all in favor? Anyone opposed? Carried. All right, so Craig and Julia, you have the floor.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be with you this afternoon. We just want to give you an update in terms of where the front-end funding policy and the reimbursement policy is at. We've had a few discussions with council and committee over the last year or so, building upon some of the work that Julia and I have been doing with the city over the last couple of years. I'm going to pass it over to Julia to walk through the presentation. We're hopeful that we can get through it in 10 or 15 minutes and then leave time for some questions and discussion following that presentation. So over to you, Julia.
Great, thanks so much. And yes, we do have a brief presentation today, just covering off the purpose and goals of the policy, and then briefly outlining some of the key contents and provisions of the draft policy to date. And then I'll end with an overview of the status of our work and next steps. So the front-end funding policy is intended to address situations where a developer wishes to advance the timing of development-related infrastructure ahead of the city's timelines. So it's intended to deal with infrastructure that's necessary for lands to be developed. So this is typically engineered infrastructure like roads, water, and wastewater projects. And in order to advance the works, the developer offers to front-end finance the works, and that could mean either constructing the works themselves or providing the funds for the city to carry out the works ahead of the original schedule. The policy minimizes the financial risk to the city of advancing works. So when the city, by comparison, front-end funds projects, there's always a risk that development activity and therefore DC recoveries will be slower than anticipated. So we're trying to sort of put that risk and burden onto the developer that is responsible for advancing the works. And so the policy will help the city to evaluate requests and decide whether or not in each specific case entering into a front-ending agreement will be sort of mutually beneficial and fiscally responsible. So here we're just showing how the policy is laid out so far. So starting with a general policy statement, and then it moves into applicability and the scope of the policy, some background and definitions. We have general provisions, a list of eligibility requirements for a DC credit agreement, approvals and reimbursement, tendering and award of projects, security, and then the authority for termination or amendment of an agreement, and then finally administration and legal fees. So just moving on, in terms of applicability of the policy, as I mentioned, it's intended to apply to the types of hard infrastructure that are really required to be in place in advance of development, really to enable development to occur. So again, things like roads, water, sanitary, stormwater management. And it'll be most applicable to projects in the ASDC areas, so the Northern Boundary Expansion Lands and Tudela Heights, where we have more of a greenfield environment that's lacking the servicing needed to enable development. And the policy, importantly, would only apply to development charge eligible costs or projects that have been identified in the most recent DC background study. So it doesn't apply to local servicing costs for which the developer would be responsible. And then finally, it's always at the city's discretion to allow a developer to front-end fund works and enter into an agreement. So staff will evaluate each request on a case-by-case basis and negotiate any terms with the developer. And then just moving on, here we've suggested a general process for front-end funding decision-making and approvals. This process is currently under discussion and it might be refined over the coming months. And in particular, we're looking at ways of integrating it with the block planning process. But generally, the process will begin with the initial application or request from the developer, which will undergo an initial review by staff, and we're suggesting the establishment of a review committee or task force that would involve key staff from key departments like development engineering, finance, I think infrastructure planning and purchasing. And then if the review committee decides to proceed with the request, staff would then establish the total value of the works to be completed, the amount eligible for credit. They would look at the extent to which the timing of the works and the growth percentage of the works is being changed from what's stated in the DC study, and an explanation for any variance and justification for that. And then the DC credit and reimbursement eligible amounts and the terms and timing of the credits would be incorporated into a DC credit agreement with the developer. And then from there, a report would be brought forward for council approval, and the approved work would proceed if approved. Once the works are complete, development engineering would notify finance, and credits would be dispersed according to the terms of the DC credit agreement. And then in terms of eligibility requirements outlined by your draft policy, they're listed here. First off, the developer must enter into a DC credit agreement. If there are multiple developers or developer groups involved, a trustee will be required to represent their interests. The cost estimate of the works and the value of DC credits and reimbursements must be reviewed and approved by the city. The developer must submit a request to the city prior to commencement of detailed design and construction. The works must be included in the most recent DC background study, as I mentioned previously. And then the DC credit is limited to the applicable service component of the DC bylaw. So for example, if it's a roads project, only DC credits related to the roads portion of the city's DC will be dispersed back to the developer. And then finally, advancement of the work should not result in any negative impact to the city's debt limits. And just moving on to the next slide, in terms of the approvals and reimbursement process, depending on the amount of the request and the applicable planning application process, the credits must be approved by council, the treasurer, or delegated staff. And approvals will be aligned with the development application process or the block planning process. A DC credit agreement will set out the timing and the amount of the DC credits, and that must be obtained prior to construction. There are also rules written into the draft policy around the maximum amount of the credit. So the policy sets this as the lesser of the stated costs in the DC background study, or the actual tender cost plus a 15% soft cost provision. And then any additional amounts may be reimbursed at the city's discretion, but that would be subject to a negotiated agreement, which would also be included in the DC credit agreement. Any non-growth components should, of course, be funded through non-DC sources, such as property taxes or utility rates. However, you might see cases where there's a significant non-growth component that might place an undue burden on existing tax or rate payers. And in that case, the city could ask the developer or require the developer to make a contribution to those non-growth costs. And then finally, tendering an award of contract. So the policy also establishes rules around project tendering, particularly for developer-led projects to ensure competitive pricing. So we're stating that any eligible project valued at over $50,000 would require a public tender, and that anything under $50,000, so a pretty small threshold, would still require invitation of a minimum of 3 vendors. Development engineering would need to review and approve the cost estimates, issue for tender specifications and drawings in accordance with sort of city standards and policies. And the developer would also be required to provide a letter of credit equal to the total estimated cost of the works, which would be held until the works are completed and reviewed by the city. So that summarizes sort of the key points that we have in the policy so far. I'm just ending here with status and next steps. So we're continuing to work with staff to finalize the policy, which will involve refining the approval processes. And in particular, we're working in a greater level of coordination with the block planning process, as often those processes will proceed ahead of the development application stage. We're also considering adding greater detail around the initial application or request process and requirements, and whether any particular form is needed or particular process. We also have been looking to the City of London as an example in particular, in working in requirements for the developer to submit a detailed work plan prior to the DC credit agreement stage. So that's something that we're looking at as well. And then we will be bringing the draft policy at sort of a high level form to a targeted consultation with developers, particularly those who are active in the ASDC and block plan areas over the summer before finalizing the policy. And then following that, a DC credit agreement template is going to be drafted by an external legal resource. And then just to end with a quick mention of a related issue that's come up and has been discussed over the past few weeks. DC prepayment agreements can be used for a similar purpose to advance works. And as we've discussed with staff, these agreements will be dealt with on sort of a case-by-case basis. Staff would need to establish a threshold total value of DC prepayments that would be needed for works to be advanced. We think that a use it or lose it clause would be needed to ensure that development advances as planned. And the city would also need to consider how to address project costs that exceed what's stated in the DC study. So DC prepayments are not something that we're dealing with through the front ending policy directly, but we may have, or the city may have ongoing discussions with specific developers if they do request to go that route instead. And that's really it for our presentation. Thanks again, and happy to take any questions.
Mayor Davis.
Yeah, Julie, a question for you through the chair on number 7, advancement of the work cannot result in negative impact to city's forecast internal annual repayment limit. What is that? The annual repayment limit.
I'll jump in here, Julia. Yes, the notion there is that obviously the municipality is restricted to how much debt you're allowed to have under provincial rules, and you have your own debt policies. And we just want to ensure that if in any way these agreements would require the municipality to do any long-term debt financing, that we ensure that anything that happens through these agreements doesn't negatively impact on your own debt repayment limits. So it's just a cross-check that's found in a few of the other policies and municipalities that we work with. It rarely comes up, but we just wanted to identify that as one of the things we want to check when we go through this consideration and approval process.
All right, and I see that part of it will involve the developer obtaining public tender invitation minimum of 3 vendors. What if the bidder is a related corporation? How do you deal with that?
Yes, what we did there, we worked together with purchasing and trying to match your own purchasing and bidding policies there. I don't think that that would preclude them from bidding, but obviously it would have to be an open process, and making sure that all parties who are submitting had a similar set of information available to them. That's certainly something specifically we can review with purchasing to see if there's any additional concerns around that scenario.
My last question to you through the chair. So how do you deal with a situation where, let's say it's a developer and say they're second in line, so to speak, in terms of how geographically a development and infrastructure would roll out. But in fact, if they're going to build, let's say, a sewer or road, they've got to build it to the capacity will also serve those who are property owners further down the line. So how do you deal with that? Where they're required to build beyond the capacity needed for their lands?
Yeah, so the policy framework identifies that scenario because it does occur quite frequently. And what happens is if we identify that the cost of the works is greater than the credits that would be derived by the development of their own lands, the front enders, and there's additional funding that's required, what will happen is the agreement will address and say that the front ender will receive additional credits from other benefiting landowners within a defined area when those other developers come forward to issue their permits. And they'll get what you'll do is effectively funnel back some of the money you've collected from those future benefiting landowners back to the front ender.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Carpenter?
Thank you. One of the questions the mayor asked was the number 7 eligibility requirement was on my list as well. But the other question I have is the DC credits. Is DC credits dollar amounts?
Typically what happens is because DC amounts themselves get indexed annually, often it's done in relation to a certain component of the charge, so that if they front-ended a road program, they would get the road component back of their DC based on a certain number of units until they're fully repaid their amount. Or sometimes it's done in relation to a specific dollar amount and a specific number of units. It can be done in either way, depending upon the nature of the project and the scenario.
Okay, so does that mean that if development charges increase and before they start building the homes and development charges are applicable, do they get the old development charges rate or do they get the new development charges rate as part of the credits and payment?
They would pay the DCs relative to whatever is applicable under the Development Charges Act, recognizing that there's freezing of rates and discountings, but the credit component will be in relation to the service, and then it will, once, like let's say they front-ended a work that cost $5 million, they would continue to receive credits until they reach the $5 million point. If their lands only allowed for $3 million of credits, then the other $2 million would be provided to them when the other benefiting landowners came over, but it would be controlled by the total amount to be credited back as opposed to a specific number of units.
Because we've done this before in Shelters Lane, the Blackburn, and that road was front-ended. But my understanding it was, the development charges were frozen at that rate. And has that happened before?
Yes, there's some agreements where the rates get frozen, and sometimes it's through these DC prepayment agreements. And when there's no, which is a distinction here that Julia identified. I'm more familiar with situations where a developer has agreed to prepay a rate and it gets frozen at a point in time, and then the rates keep increasing and they sit on it for 10 years. And that's why we want to have a use it or lose it clause. Likewise, here I don't think there's as big a risk on the credit side because they will have front-ended the works and paid for them and in place them. And now it's just the rate at which they get repaid as opposed to if they do or don't.
Okay, I like that use or lose it because I think that's what we had before with that. That's my understanding with the Blackburn and the Better Memorial Parkway and the developer in that area, that the rates are frozen. Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much. That's the end of my questions, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further, of course, Mayor Davis?
Yeah, thank you. So does interest accrue on the development credit?
It depends on the nature of the agreement itself. The development charge rates, we have cash flow and effectively include some financing. There are agreements whereby the front ender themselves may pay a rate that doesn't include financing, and then the other benefiting owners will pay the credit. But then it's a part as to how the agreement is structured as to whether or not the developer is getting any financing costs back on that. It's a particular, it can be done in either way.
Okay, thanks.
Very good. Any further questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you so much, Greg and Julia. Stick around in case there are additional questions that come up during the debate portion. So we'll move forward to item 4.1 and looking for a mover and a seconder that report 2023-439 entitled the DAP Planning and Development Fees and Front End Policy Reviews Fee Received. Looking for a mover and a seconder on that. Moved by Mayor Davis, seconded by Councillor Carpenter, and discussion. Seeing no one to speak in the room, I'll go to Councillor Carpenter.
We're just receiving this, and this is going to go out to the community. There's going to be discussion amongst the developers and builders on the rates and how this is going to work. Is that my understanding?
Nicole?
Sure, yes. So today we are looking for feedback from the Building and Construction Task Force. The next step will be for staff to go back and take away some of the comments and questions that we heard today and maybe make some further refinements to some of the recommendations and the information that's being proposed. And then we will be looking to gain some comment and consultation with the stakeholder group, including the development community, Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Home Builders Association. And then using that input to help formulate final recommendations to council likely in September. And then with a recommendation for when we will ultimately see a fee increase or the use of these agreements.
Would it be too much for me to ask I mentioned earlier, but a 5-year phase in at the 80% and a 5-year phase in at 100%, what those numbers would look like to give us some options?
No, absolutely. We can provide that information and look to provide that type of analysis ultimately when we're bringing forward our final recommendations report as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mayor Davis.
So do staff, do you want anything further from us today? I mean, I think through our questions, we've implicitly asked for and explicitly asked for additional information, but are you looking for comment on the actual fees themselves at this point, or?
Through the chair to Mayor Davis, I would say that yes, if you do have comments in terms of what you've seen today that you would like us to take away and consider, then we would welcome those comments.
Well, for me personally, it's difficult to make a comment without some of that additional information.
So,
Madam Chair, I think from one of the big takeaways I'll have, if we're going to the development community, we should be able to answer the mayor's question, which was, if we're going to pay all these fees, are we going to see improvements? Are we going to see a streamlining of the system? Are we going to see better performance? I think that's a valid question.
Yeah.
I was asked it in the past, having done a similar exercise, and I think it's a critical question to answer. That would be a key takeaway.
Yeah, and some of the comparables too, with a little more detail, not just medium or high.
agreed. And sorry, have you completed?
Yes, I have.
Thank you. So I will just share some of my thoughts, and my obvious personal background is, in real estate, and I've had some really great conversations with the home builders associations over the years. And I think the one recurring comment is efficiencies. There seems to be a lot of comment that there's some redundancies in our processes, and what steps have we taken to find those efficiencies and just streamline it for someone coming in? Because if we're going to say we're increasing these costs so that we are downloading this to the taxpayer, we better be able to explain what we've done to find those efficiencies. And there will be some pushback from the home builders community, from the association, and from the developers around town because, and from the community as a whole, and it's something we need to take into account, is that these fees don't just become higher fees for the developer. This becomes a cost inflation that gets downloaded to the home buyer every single time. So every time we increase our fees, just know that's coming out of the pocket of the taxpayer in one way, shape, or form, whether it be through their property taxes or through the home buying purchase process. So I would like to know that we've done everything that we can before increasing these fees to find every efficiency and remove every redundancy that we can before we proceed, or before I can say that I'm ready to proceed with increasing these fees. So that's sort of where my brain is at right now. And I think maybe some follow-up on that, or maybe some further studies. And I know we're already running a pretty lean ship, but this comes down to, on a form, why am I filling out the same information on 3 different forms? Why isn't it just there? You know, why aren't the departments speaking as fluidly as they could be? These are just some things that I've heard over the years. Maybe they've been rectified, but those are some questions that I would need answered before I can commit to feeling comfortable increasing those fees. Any further comments? I see Councillor Carpenter.
Thank you. Just one, Madam Chair, to you. When we did development charges, I heard the same thing from the home builders time and time again. And they always said, you raise the fees on development charges, it flows right back to the price of the house. Well, I've never bought into that argument, and I still don't. The actual cost of the house is the value of the house is what the market dictates, what people are willing to pay. Because, you know, when we've seen houses go from $500,000 to $1 million, fees didn't change whatsoever, development fees or our fees. So I want to make that point well known. You know, it might have an impact when it goes back to the price of the land and what you put on it. I'm not sure about that. The other point I would like to make is we'll talk about our planning staff. I've been involved with the planning, and I'm involved with all plans in my ward, and I go to all the meetings and I talk to all the developers. And a lot of times when developers are saying to me that planning staff isn't getting this done in time, it's because they actually haven't done their end. They haven't filled out their form. They haven't got their study done. And then they'll say, well, you know, it's that planning staff doing that. And then we find out when I call the planning staff that they're waiting for something from the actual developer. So there's a balance here. Like we're going to hear one side of the story. We need to hear both sides of the story. So I'm just want to keep that open. Thank you.
Sure. And I'll just add to my comments further that it used to be, I would say maybe 6 years ago, that new homes used to come at a lesser price tag because there were some obstacles, right? Like you had to live with no grass for a while and no basements done, and none of these updates were done. And now we're seeing that the new home price is dictating the price of the resale market, driving both of them up. So there is an impact. The degree to which you understand the impact is, you know, subjective to your involvement in the real estate world, but there is an impact. It does come down the pipeline into the consumer, and I won't get into too much more detail on how that is, but it definitely does. So something to keep in mind that I will definitely be keeping in mind when I share my opinions moving forward on this. Any further conversation on this before we call the vote? Seeing none, all in favor? Carried. Moving forward, we have consent item 5.1, the minutes from the last meeting. Moved by Mayor Davis, seconded by Councillor Carpenter. Yeah. All in favor? Carried. We have no notice of motions, and this meeting is adjourned.